Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
There's something surreal about the moment your name echoes across a giant auditorium, your feet hitting the stage you once imagined from the back row of your first-year lectures, and everyone claps as if they know the price you paid to get there. That day, I walked across that stage in a black cap and gown, holding my head high while my chest carried the weight of 3 years of all-nighters, cold coffee, imposter syndrome, and student loan balances that felt more like prison sentences than financial aid. And as I walked, just a few steps behind me, came Tessa, same gown, same diploma, same proud applause from our parents in the third row, waving like they were cheering for a pair of champions. You'd think, in a perfect world, that moment would feel like a shared victory, two sisters, side by side, having climbed the same academic mountain. But deep down, even as I smiled for the cameras and clutched my degree like a lifeline, I knew something was off. I could feel it under my skin, like a current humming just beneath the surface. It wasn't jealousy, I'd never been wired that way. It was something more complicated, something colder, something quieter. A sense that this moment, like so many others before it, wasn't really mine in the way it should have been. And it wasn't because I hadn't earned it, I'd clawed my way through law school with grit and grit alone. No safety nets, no parental deposits in my bank account, no surprise tuition payments magically appearing when the semester bill hit my inbox. I had made every loan payment on my own, signed every promissory note with shaking hands, and budgeted every goddamn dollar of my grocery money like my life depended on it, because it did. Tessa, on the other hand, had always moved through life like the road had been paved just a little smoother under her feet. Not that she didn't work hard. She did, in her way. But she had something I never had, the unwavering backing of our parents, both financially and emotionally. When her laptop broke, they bought her a new one. When her car needed repairs, they covered it without blinking. When she needed rent money during her internship in DC, they wired it that same afternoon. Meanwhile, I was working part-time at a legal aid clinic and tutoring undergrads on the weekends just to cover my books and bus pass. But I never complained. I told myself that what I was building would be mine alone, that no one could take it from me. I believed, maybe naively, that one day my parents would see that too, that they'd recognize the effort it took to keep going when no one was cushioning the fall. That day after graduation, we all went out for dinner at this upscale Italian place my mom had picked. White tablecloths, wine glasses that looked like they belonged in a museum, and a menu without a single price listed. I knew just sitting at that table was a stretch for me, but I played along. I wore a smile, toasted my sister, made small talk about bar prep courses and future plans. I was even starting to think maybe I'd misread things, that maybe I was just being cynical, reading too much into the usual family dynamics. But then the moment came. The one that cracked open everything. Just as dessert arrived, my mom raised her glass again, her voice a little louder, her smile a little too wide. To Tessa, she said, pausing dramatically like she was delivering a line she'd rehearsed in the mirror. Not only for graduating with honors, but for officially being debt-free. The table erupted in polite applause, forks clinking against glasses, everyone turning to look at her with admiration and awe. My heart stopped for a second, not because I misunderstood, but because I didn't. That phrase hit me like a slap in the face. Debt-free. And she kept going, like it was a hallmark moment. We wanted to give her a real start, so we paid off all her loans. She deserves it after everything she's worked through. I just sat there, frozen, my smile still plastered on my face like a mask I couldn't peel off fast enough. I looked at Tessa, who beamed and shrugged like she hadn't known they'd make such a scene out of it. Maybe she hadn't. Maybe she had. I don't know. What I do know is that no one looked at me. No one asked if I was okay. No one wondered how I felt sitting next to a fully funded sister while my own debt hovered like a second shadow I couldn't outrun. And when I finally found my voice gentle, cautious, I asked, "You paid off all of it?" My mother turned to me, her expression soft but dismissive, like I'd just asked a silly question about the menu. "Well, sweetheart, we figured you'd be fine." You've always been so independent, so driven. We knew you could handle it on your own. She needed it more. That's the moment something shifted in me, not just emotionally, but physically, like something internal cracked and realigned. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't storm out or flip the table or throw my napkin in my mother's face like some cheap melodrama. I just smiled, tight and clean, and raised my glass like the dutiful daughter I'd always been. But inside, something dark had started to brew. Not rage exactly. Something colder, sharper, calculated. Something that didn't scream but whispered, and that whisper said, "They think this story ends here. They think I'll swallow this the way I've swallowed everything else. But they're wrong." So I clinked my glass against theirs and said, "To family," and in that moment, I knew they had no idea what was coming next. There's a particular kind of ache that creeps in when you realize your value in your own family was measured not by love or character, but by how little trouble you caused. Growing up, that ache was quiet at first, a whisper, a flicker, a subtle tilt in how affection was handed out around the dinner table. It took me years to notice it for what it was, because when you're a child, you don't measure fairness the way adults do. You just internalize it. You adapt. You learn that some people get softness while others get speeches about being strong. And I was always the strong one, the one who didn't need as much, the one who had her head on straight, while Tessa floated in and out of crisis with a trail of comfort and cushions behind her. It didn't start with law school, not by a long shot. This imbalance was stitched into the fabric of our lives from the very beginning. When Tessa fell off her bike and scraped her knee, my mother ran down the driveway with panic in her eyes, scooping her up like she'd been shot. When I came home with a bruised ankle from soccer practice, she handed me an ice pack and said, "You'll be fine, you're tough." When Tessa cried over a bad grade, they offered her a tutor. When I brought home straight A's, they said, "We knew you could do it." There was no celebration, no hug, no fanfare, just the assumption that I'd manage, because I always did. And I did manage, even when it meant going without. I scraped together my undergrad tuition by stacking part-time jobs and applying for every scholarship I could find, even the ones that required 3-page essays and interviews in other cities. I skipped spring break trips, declined internships that didn't offer stipends, and lived in a shoebox apartment with water stains on the ceiling because it was the only place I could afford near campus. Meanwhile, Tessa was in a dorm room with matching throw pillows and a mini fridge stocked with snacks she never bought herself. Every now and then she'd flash a crisp envelope from our parents, a surprise check, just to help out, or a prepaid credit card tucked inside a care package. She always acted like it was no big deal, just part of how families show love. But I knew what it really meant. It meant she was the one they worried about, and I was the one expected to figure it out alone. You start to notice things more sharply when you're on your own dime. You hear the way your mother's voice shifts when she talks about your sister, how it softens, how it wraps her in warmth like she's made of glass. You see the way your father's eyes dart away when you mention financial stress, how quickly he changes the subject or offers some vague advice instead of real support. They don't mean harm, at least not in the traditional sense. But neglect wrapped in polite indifference still stings just as hard. I used to wonder if maybe it was a compliment, in some twisted way, that they saw me as competent, capable, self-sufficient. That being the independent one meant they respected me. But it never felt like respect. It felt like abandonment disguised as flattery. It felt like being left to hold the weight of my own life while watching someone else get carried. And no matter how many times I tried to reframe it, tried to tell myself that being the strong one was its own kind of power, there was always that gnawing voice in the back of my mind asking, if they really saw your strength, why didn't they show up when it counted? I want to pause here and ask something, not rhetorically, but honestly, have you ever been the responsible one in your family? The one who always got less because you needed less? The one who got praise instead of help, duty instead of support, silence instead of comfort? And be honest, did it ever feel like a reward? Or did it feel like punishment with better branding? Because if you've been there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You know the invisible weight of always having to prove you don't need anyone, while secretly wondering what it would feel like to be someone's priority just once. You know how lonely it is to be the pillar everyone leans on when you never ask to be built out of stone. That debt-free dinner celebration might have been the flashpoint, but it wasn't the real betrayal. The real betrayal happened in 100 quiet moments long before that day ever arrived. It happened every time my parents looked at my success and saw it as a reason to withhold rather than to celebrate. Every time they interpreted my competence as an excuse to redirect their attention toward someone else. Every time they acted like support was something that had to be earned through fragility rather than effort. After the party, I slipped outside for air, my head buzzing with the weight of it all. That's when Grandpa Ed found me, standing near the back gate with my shoes in my hand and a half-empty glass of wine sweating in the humidity. He didn't say much at first, just stood beside me, looking out over the lawn where people were still laughing and clinking glasses like nothing had cracked beneath the surface. Then, without turning to face me, he muttered low and slow, almost like he was speaking to himself. "You're not the first they've done this to." I turned toward him, startled, unsure if I heard him right. But he didn't clarify. He just gave me a sideways glance and sipped his drink like he'd said enough. And I stood there wondering what that meant. What history I didn't know, what truths had been buried beneath years of polite conversations and family holidays. And that's when something shifted again, not in anger this time, but in clarity. Maybe this wasn't just about favoritism. Maybe it was about patterns. Legacies. Cycles passed down so quietly you don't even notice you're part of them until someone finally breaks the script. Maybe I'd spent all this time trying to earn something that was never really mine to earn. Maybe I'd been asking the wrong questions altogether. But I wasn't done yet. Not even close. Because if they thought my silence meant acceptance, they were about to learn how wrong they'd been. Starting my first job at the firm should have felt like a moment of triumph, a turning point, a reward after years of sleepless nights, buried textbooks, and caffeine-fueled survival. Instead, it felt more like trying to hold my balance on a tightrope with bricks strapped to my back. The job itself wasn't the problem, not really. I liked the work well enough, the grind, the long hours, the sharp minds, the high-stakes negotiations that made my heart pound in the best kind of way. But what weighed on me, what hollowed out the pride I should have felt, was the quiet, unspoken truth of it all. I was working to dig myself out of a pit that my own family had stood beside and watched me fall into without offering a rope. Every month when I opened my loan statements, it felt like a fresh slap, a reminder that while I was building a future brick by brick, Tessa was busy decorating hers without ever having to pay for the foundation. My mornings started early, too early sometimes, with packed subway rides, stress headaches, and client files that never seemed to end. Meanwhile, Tessa was flying to Austin for a self-discovery weekend, or renting some sleek, overpriced apartment downtown, furnished by what she called strategic parental investment, which was just a sugar-coated way of saying Mom and Dad had paid for it. They had given her everything short of a red carpet, and she strutted across it like she'd laid it herself. And the part that burned the most wasn't that she was happy, it was that they were proud. Not proud of her in the way that made you feel warm, but in the way that made them feel validated, like her freedom was a trophy they could polish and display at brunch conversations. They never once acknowledged that my success had come without safety nets or shortcuts, that my path had teeth and I walked it anyway. No, instead they filled our phone calls with updates about Tessa's new furniture, Tessa's travel plans, Tessa's spontaneous yoga retreat in Santa Fe, as if I should applaud the life she was living while I was still knee-deep in minimum payments and spreadsheets. I didn't tell them about the panic attacks that hit me in the stairwell after work some nights, or about the moment I realized I'd need another 2 years just to chip away at the interest on my loans before I even touched the principal. I didn't tell them that I'd skipped buying groceries 1 week just to make an extra payment. What would have been the point? They would have just said, "You're doing great, honey, you're so strong," and moved on to Tessa's latest Instagram-worthy accomplishment. Because that's what strength meant to them, something to admire from a distance while offering nothing to lighten the load. And still, I didn't confront them. I didn't scream or demand fairness or write some scathing letter. I held it all in because I thought silence was strength. I thought dignity meant swallowing resentment and smiling through it. I told myself that holding your tongue was maturity, that rising above was the better path. But the truth is, there's a fine, invisible line between strength and silence, and I was starting to wonder if I had crossed it somewhere along the way. I wasn't just being dignified, I was being erased. Bit by bit, moment by moment, sacrifice by sacrifice. One night, after a particularly long day where I'd clocked almost 12 hours at the office without so much as a lunch break, I got another call from my mother. Her voice was light, cheerful, dripping with the same condescending warmth she always used when she was about to say something that would twist the knife a little deeper. "Tessa's going to Italy," she said, as if we were discussing the weather. "We thought it would be good for her, just to get some life experience. She's feeling a little lost lately. You understand, right?" I wanted to laugh, to scream, to ask if she even remembered that I hadn't taken a single vacation since graduation, that I hadn't seen the inside of an airport in over a year, that I was tired down to my bones and still they thought I had nothing to complain about. But I didn't say any of that. I just said, "Sounds nice," and hung up before my voice cracked. That was the moment I realized something needed to change. Not just in how I dealt with them, but in how I saw myself. Because if I kept letting them treat my struggle like an afterthought, I'd start to believe it deserved to be one. I'd start to believe that working myself to the edge of collapse was normal, that being self-made meant being alone, that the price of independence was silence. And just when I thought that weight couldn't get any heavier, a call came in that knocked the breath right out of me. It was from the bank, not my usual loan servicer, not a routine message. The voice on the other end was polite but confused. "We received an inquiry about your loan details," the man said, "but it wasn't from you." My stomach dropped. He rattled off the name, Janice Whitman. My mother. For a second, I couldn't even process what I was hearing. Why the hell was my mother looking into my financial records? Why now, after everything, after her smug little celebration dinner and her repeated reassurances that I didn't need help? Was she suddenly feeling guilty? Curious? Controlling? I didn't know. But what I did know, with absolute certainty, was that whatever reason she had, it wasn't going to be good. And just like that, the silence I'd worn like armor began to feel less like protection and more like a liability. Because when people assume you'll never fight back, they stop being careful. And when they stop being careful, that's when you strike. There's a strange kind of energy that creeps in when clarity hits you harder than anger ever could. A shift in the air, a tightening behind your ribs. The quiet realization that you've finally stopped expecting fairness from people who were never capable of giving it in the first place. That's what it felt like the moment I hung up with the bank and sat staring at the wall in my tiny apartment, still gripping the phone like it might offer more answers if I held it long enough. My mother had gone digging into my loan information, and I didn't believe for one second it was some innocent mix-up or a well-meaning gesture of concern. No, this wasn't her stumbling into something she shouldn't have touched. This was a calculated move, the kind of thing people do when they think they still hold leverage over you. So I called the bank back and asked a few more questions, just enough to confirm what I already suspected. She hadn't inquired just once. There were multiple calls logged under her name, each one trying to verify my account balances, repayment history, and interest rates. But that wasn't even the most surprising part. The surprise came when the representative, a woman with a clipped, professional tone, mentioned that there had been a note in my file years ago back during my first year of undergrad, indicating a private student loan that was co-signed by a secondary party. "It looks like your parents co-signed one of your first tuition loans," she said, almost like it was an afterthought. It was a small amount compared to the others, but it's still active. I sat there, stunned, as those words echoed in my head. My parents had co-signed a loan for me and somehow managed to act like they'd never lifted a finger toward my education. Either they forgot, which I didn't believe for a second, or they hoped I had. And maybe I had, back then, when I was too busy juggling coursework and late shifts to pay attention to every document I was signing. But now, knowing what I knew, something shifted inside me. I realized that the one thing they had always dangled above me, their claim that they never helped me financially, and therefore owed me nothing, wasn't even true. They'd helped, yes, but only in secret. And now, that tiny detail, that small thread, was something I could pull. I didn't explode. I didn't call and scream down the line or demand answers or march over to their house and throw the paperwork in their smug, self-satisfied faces. No, I sat with it. I let it simmer. Because rage is messy, but precision, that's power. So I consulted a lawyer, quietly and thoroughly. I asked about the co-signed loan, about legal responsibility, about any clauses they might have forgotten existed. And what I learned was simple but potent. Technically, if I chose to reassign the loan obligation through a very specific legal maneuver and included the right supporting documentation, I could ensure the remaining balance would be solely theirs to handle. It wasn't a malicious move, not exactly. It was a correction, a formal acknowledgement of the help they once gave and then pretended never existed. So I wrote the letter. Not a bitter rant, not some unhinged attack, just a calmly worded legal notice wrapped in a neutral tone that detailed the facts, the terms, and the legal responsibility they had unknowingly reaffirmed the moment my mother started snooping. I didn't write it out of spite. I wrote it because it felt like reclaiming something. Not money, not control, something deeper. A sense of balance. A way to finally stand at eye level with people who had always looked down on me while claiming they were lifting me up. A few days later, right when I was still weighing whether to send it, another surprise landed in my inbox. It was an invitation. White cardstock, gold trim, bold serif font. Please join us in celebrating Tessa's debt-free journey. A party. An entire goddamn event built around the fact that my parents had erased her debt while leaving mine to gather dust and compound interest. And there it was, the final push I didn't even know I needed. I stared at the invitation for a long while, reading the words over, and then I smiled. It wasn't a forced smile. It wasn't tight or bitter or sarcastic. It was real. Because I knew right then exactly where I would deliver that letter. Not in a cold envelope stuffed in a mailbox. Not in a rushed confrontation over the phone. But in person, with a calm face, in the middle of the celebration they had built on the back of a lie. They had always underestimated me. Not because I was weak, but because I wasn't loud. Because I didn't push back in the moment. Because I held my ground in silence while they mistook my stillness for surrender. But they had forgotten something crucial, that quiet doesn't mean powerless and restraint is not the same as forgiveness. So yes, I RSVP'd with a smile. And I began planning what I would wear, what I would say, and how I would walk into that room without an ounce of bitterness, only the quiet satisfaction of someone who finally held the upper hand. The first thing I noticed when I stepped into the backyard was the string lights, hundreds of them, hung with the kind of meticulous effort that made it clear this wasn't just a casual celebration, but something my mother had been planning for weeks, maybe months. The entire space was dressed to impress: crisp linen tablecloths, elegantly folded napkins, soft jazz humming from discreet speakers tucked beneath floral arrangements that probably cost more than my monthly loan payments. Waiters in black aprons floated between guests with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, and there was even a corner photo booth with a custom backdrop that read, in swirling gold script, "Debt-free and fabulous." Tessa stood in the center of it all, beaming like a bride, surrounded by friends and extended family who clinked glasses in her honor and gushed over her next chapter of freedom. She wore a white jumpsuit and heels that probably cost half a rent check, laughing effortlessly with her hair curled just so, the picture-perfect version of someone whose life had been neatly unburdened by the kindness of generous parents. That phrase, generous parents, was tossed around a lot that night. Everywhere I turned, I heard it echoed in one form or another. "They're just so giving," someone said behind me, and I didn't even turn to see who it was. "Janice and Richard did such a beautiful thing," another voice murmured near the drinks table. I wish my parents had been that thoughtful after school. And through it all, I just stood there, holding a glass of wine in one hand, swirling it slowly like it might reveal some kind of deeper meaning if I stared at it long enough. I listened to them all speak as if generosity had no shadow, as if what they'd done for Tessa wasn't just a gift, but an irrefutable sign of love and fairness. No one asked about me, not really. There were a few polite congratulations, a passing comment about my job, a quick, "You must be doing so well now," but it was clear who the spotlight belonged to. And I was fine with that. Because the moment I'd been waiting for wasn't about stealing attention, it was about making sure they understood what silence had been hiding all along. As the night wore on, the speeches began. First, Tessa's best friend stood and gave a tearful toast about their friendship and dreams of opening a practice together. Then came my mother, her voice sweet with pride, her eyes glistening just enough to seem genuine, but not so much that it ruined her makeup. She talked about resilience, about supporting dreams, about the importance of lifting up those you love when the world gets heavy. She didn't mention me at all, not once, not even a nod in my direction. And when she finally raised her glass and said, "To Tessa, whose strength and spirit inspired us to give her the future she deserves," I knew it was time. I walked slowly to the head of the table, not hurried, not dramatic, just calm and deliberate, every step measured like a closing argument in a courtroom. People turned their heads as I moved past, the hum of conversation dipping just slightly, curiosity flickering across their faces like they sensed something was coming but couldn't quite name it yet. I stopped beside my parents and pulled a small white envelope from my bag, the same size and shape as the ones they used to hand to Tessa over dinner tables and holidays, the same kind of envelope that once held checks signed with love and favoritism. I handed it to my mother first. She took it with a polite smile, clearly assuming it was a card, maybe even a thank you note. But as she opened it and unfolded the contents, I saw her face change, slowly at first, then all at once. Her mouth parted slightly, the color draining from her cheeks as her eyes scanned the words. She blinked rapidly, reading again to make sure she hadn't misunderstood. My father leaned in to look over her shoulder, and I watched his posture shift, stiffening as the words settled into place. It was like watching two people trying to swallow glass and pretend it was champagne. Inside that envelope was a legally binding document, signed, notarized, ironclad, that transferred full financial responsibility for the remaining balance of the co-signed undergraduate loan directly to them. It was airtight, retroactively activated through a clause in the original loan agreement that allowed for reassignment of debt under specific circumstances. Circumstances my mother had unknowingly triggered when she accessed my private loan records without consent. I hadn't even known the clause existed until the lawyer pointed it out during our consultation. But once I did, it was like finding the pressure point I hadn't known I'd been looking for. The document wasn't malicious. It didn't accuse or insult. It simply stated the legal shift of responsibility, citing the co-signer's original obligation and confirming that due to administrative action, the debt now fell under their names. No drama, no confrontation, just clean, legal fact. My mother stared at it for a long moment before finally looking up at me, her face pale and frozen, her lips pressed into a line so tight it looked painful. My father didn't speak at all. He just sat there, one hand still on the edge of the table like he needed something to hold on to. I didn't say a word. I didn't explain or gloat or ask if they understood. I just raised my glass one final time and said, "To fairness," and turned away before they could respond. Behind me, I could hear the low murmurs starting to ripple across the crowd, confusion settling in, whispers spreading like slow-moving wildfire as people noticed the tension, the expressions, the shift in mood. I didn't care. Let them talk. Let them wonder. Because the truth was, I didn't need their recognition anymore. I didn't need their applause or their validation. All I needed was that moment, that quiet, satisfying moment when they realized the golden child wasn't the only one capable of changing the game. The silence that followed my quiet little handoff at Tessa's party wasn't the kind that fades into the background and disappears. It was a heavy kind of silence, thick and lingering, the kind that hangs in the air long after the music stops playing and the champagne starts to go flat. My mother, bless her performative little heart, tried her best to recover, tried to glue her smile back onto her face as if it hadn't just cracked wide open for everyone to see. She folded the document carefully, a little too slowly, like she was hoping it would vanish if she handled it gently enough. Then, without looking at me, she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for me to hear, "You didn't have to do this." There was no apology in her voice, no real regret, Just that same old tone she always used when she wanted to scold me without looking like she was scolding me. I looked at her, calm and steady, my wine glass still cool in my hand, and said simply, but I did. I didn't raise my voice, didn't dramatize the moment, didn't give her the satisfaction of some big emotional outburst she could twist into a narrative about me being petty or ungrateful. I gave her only the truth, clean and simple, the kind she never knew how to handle. Across the table, Grandpa Ed let out a low chuckle, the kind that cuts through pretense like a scalpel. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded, watching the whole exchange with an expression I couldn't quite place, part amusement, part vindication. Then he said, in that dry, gravelly voice of his, maybe next time you'll pay attention to who you're raising, not who you're enabling. The words dropped like a stone in the center of the table, and for a moment, nobody moved. It was the first time I'd ever seen my mother speechless. Even my father, who usually avoided conflict like it was contagious, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes flicking to the envelope like it might bite him. After that, I didn't linger. I made my goodbyes short, polite, and unfussy. I hugged the relatives who didn't deserve the awkward tension, smiled at a few confused guests, and walked out of that backyard without looking back. I didn't need to see their expressions again. I already knew what they looked like, shocked, betrayed, maybe even a little scared. But more than anything, I knew that for the first time in my life, they were finally seeing me clearly, not as the reliable background character in someone else's story, not as the footnote to Tessa's golden narrative, but as a woman who knew exactly how to hit where it hurt without ever raising her voice. The weeks that followed were quiet in the strangest way. Not peaceful, not resolved, just eerily still, like a house after a storm where nothing looks broken, but everything feels off. I didn't hear from my mother again, at least not directly. She didn't call, didn't write, didn't show up on my doorstep demanding answers. But I knew the silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. She was licking her wounds, rebuilding her story, finding a way to turn this into another one of her victim narratives. That was her style, always the wronged mother, never the one who did the wounding. My father called a few times. I let it ring every time. He didn't leave messages, didn't follow up with texts. He just called and let the silence pile up on my voicemail like dust on an old photograph. Maybe he thought I'd cave, that I'd reach out eventually and offer some kind of explanation or closure. But I had nothing left to give him. Not after all the years of him choosing comfort over confrontation, peacekeeping over parenting. Tessa, of course, couldn't help herself. She texted one night out of the blue, her words short and clipped. You didn't have to make it ugly. I stared at the message for a long time, debating whether to respond, wondering if I even wanted to open that door again. But then I thought about everything that had led us here, the choices, the patterns, the long line of moments where she'd benefited from my silence. So I typed out a reply, simple and clean, wasn't me who did. She didn't answer after that, and I didn't expect her to. Eventually, I moved into my new apartment, a modest space, nothing extravagant, but entirely mine, paid for with my own hands, my own salary, my own sacrifice. No cosigners, no hidden strings, no envelopes from parents pretending generosity was the same as love. I unpacked my things slowly, savoring the space, the solitude, the quiet dignity of building something on my own terms. At the bottom of one box, tucked between old textbooks and framed photos, I found the letter Grandpa Ed had given me a few months earlier, the one I hadn't really looked at since he handed it over at a family dinner where no one else even noticed. I unfolded it carefully, reading his sharp, neat handwriting. It wasn't long, just a few lines, but enough to leave a mark. You did it the right way, it said. Some people will never understand what that costs, but you do. Just remember, sometimes justice wears a different suit than forgiveness. I held that letter for a long while, longer than I meant to, letting the weight of those words settle into me like an anchor finally finding the ocean floor. Later that night, after the last box had been broken down and the last wineglass shelved, there was a knock at my door. It was Eric, a colleague from work who'd helped me carry furniture earlier in the week. He brought a bottle of red and a quiet kind of companionship I'd grown to appreciate. We sat by the window with our glasses, watching the city lights flicker beneath the dark sky. At some point, he looked at me and asked softly, "You thinking about them?" I didn't answer. I just poured another glass and stared out the window, watching the cars roll by like ghosts of a life I'd finally left behind. Maybe I was thinking about them. Maybe I wasn't. Maybe the real victory wasn't the letter or the debt or even the silence I'd carved in return, but the fact that I no longer needed their approval to feel whole. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.